All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Pretty excited to present today. We're talking about the upcoming trial that's coming up on June 2nd for Eric Holder, who is being charged with having murdered Nipsey Hussle. He's got a couple other charges. We'll get into that as well. But it's just really important for me to be able to break some of these things down as a defense attorney. If you don't already know me, I'm a criminal defense attorney. Been practicing law for going on 14 years. So I'll be going into my 15th year in just a few days. And so I have actually represented people facing life in prison. I've gone to trial on 2 murder cases. I have an attempted murder coming up. And so I'm very familiar with what goes on going into these type of trials. And so I just add a level of insight that isn't quite as common as some of the information that you'll end up hearing on, say, the hip hop blogs and everything, people covering this stuff. And so I just want to add that insight. And so, but before I go forward, I definitely want to pay all due respect to the late Nipsey Hussle and his family. My heart goes out to his family. He left behind children. He left behind Miss London. They apparently had a beautiful relationship, and so this one hurts. This one just really hurt. And as I was preparing through this, because I went through a lot of materials, we'll actually end up going through some of the grand jury testimony. So those transcripts were originally sealed, and then apparently they were then released, and so they were released to the media. And so there's about 515 pages of testimony. I didn't go through all of it. I went through a good deal of the testimony to get a feel for what the evidence was going to be, and so we're going to go ahead and break down some of that information. But yeah, as I was going through these materials, Dimitri, what's up, man? That's my brother right there. Shawty, what's good? Appreciate y'all coming through. But yeah, as I was going through these transcripts and preparing for today, I was thinking about when I heard Victory Lap for the first time. And for me, I remember preparing for every law school exam, preparing for every law school final exam. Some people may know, some people may not. I listened to 50 Cent's Hustler's Ambition before every single law school final exam. And it just put me in the zone. And as I listened to Victory Lap, that first intro track, it's just one of those songs. And I'm not gonna play it here because I don't want YouTube to block my stream. But if you go and listen to that Victory Lap and the zone that he was in, and I could picture myself, if I was in law school when Victory Lap dropped, that probably would have been the track that I played, because I just felt so locked in listening to it. And I remember I was in the grocery store. I was listening to Victory Lap in the grocery store for the first time. And I think I posted, I was looking to see if I could find it. But I had posted, I was like, because I think I was in like Whole Foods or something like that. I was like, and I know I was mean mugging because I was just locked in. I was like, man, they're about to kick me out of this grocery store. Because I know, I'm in this broccoli, I'm in the produce section looking crazy. But that, just thinking that was his first major release. Nipsey had for a decade, he had been grinding the underground scene, underground West Coast gangster rap, and Victory Lap is kind of hard to believe that was actually his first major release. And so, I just pulled out some lyrics from that original track, the intro track. It says, "I'm finna take it there. This time I'm gonna make it clear. Spoke some things into the universe and they appeared. I won't say it's worth it. I won't say it's fair. I'll say it's worth it. I won't say it's fair. Find your purpose or you waste your air." And that's just kind of an example of the depth of his lyrics. And he was just different. You could just tell there was something different about Nipsey. And, you know, Nipsey was a West Coast rap legend. He was an entrepreneur. He was a community activist. He's just an all-around inspirational figure. You go back, you watch some of these videos where Nipsey's talking about, you know, going back and rebuilding his hood, going back, putting money back in his community, providing jobs for people who just come home. And you'll hear even from some of this testimony of some of the just absolutely beautiful things that Nipsey did. And he was working on stopping gang violence. He was putting folks up on game. He was a man of the people. And that's why this one just hurt so much. You know, we as a people, and I could feel myself just getting emotional thinking about it. When you think about who he was and who he was becoming and where he was going, all the wonderful things that he was going to end up doing. And for, you know, for him to just, you know, for him to just be robbed and his life taken away was an absolute tragedy. And I even think, you know, because I'm a hip hop head. If you don't know me, I DJ. I'm a hip hop DJ, and so that's just another different perspective that you're getting. You know, not only are you getting a criminal defense attorney with well over a decade of experience handling these type of cases, you know, handling gang cases, handling murder cases, handling, you know, complex cases, but then you also get somebody who's actually in touch with the culture. Because no disrespect to anybody, but, you know, yes. What's up? Apple Tree, my man, Gerald, my man, Edward, thanks for coming through. But we're just speaking on this because there's a lot of folks who are out there speaking on the culture that that aren't really in the culture. You know what I mean? It's, you know, speaking from an outside perspective. So I'm giving you an inside perspective from within the culture, but also from, you know, a legal standpoint as an expert. And yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit. You know, we're going to talk about that a little bit. You know, 50 Cent, he said, hey, fuck the hood when he made it out, you know, and he's talked about that. You know, he said, hey, listen, if I go back, you know, somebody could want to make a name for themselves. Somebody, you know, he's a millionaire, might want to go and rob him. So this is a big thing. We start talking about the culture. We start talking about, you know, going back to your hood where you came from and the dangers that can come along with that. And so the other thing that kind of brought this up was Kendrick Lamar dropping the Heart Part 5. And listen, when he dropped that, listen, there's certain rappers that you have to be in a certain mindset to listen to what they have to say. And Kendrick's on that list of rappers that you can't just be doing any old thing because he's going to say some stuff that's going to go over your head the first time anyway, but you just got to be focused. And when I heard the Heart Part 5, I started to play it because my boy sent me a text. Yo, have you heard the Heart Part 5? I'm like, nah, I haven't heard it yet. I started to play it. Just got a couple measures in, a couple bars in. I was like, nah, I'm not ready for this. A couple days later, I was in the gym. I was on the treadmill. I was like, let me get to this track because I started seeing it all over social media. Everybody's talking about it. And, you know, I'm sitting up here and he's talking about the culture and the problems in the culture. And he gets to that Nipsey verse. And you hear him start spitting in Nipsey's flow. And you hear him start speaking as Nipsey. And you see the face change to Nipsey. Oh, man. You know, I almost fell off the treadmill. I almost fell out the treadmill. But, you know, this is just another tragedy, another atrocity that happens in the name of culture. And so we're going to get to it. On March 31st, 2019, Eric Holder is alleged to have fired at least 10 rounds into Nipsey Hussle using a semi-automatic handgun in one hand and a silver revolver in the other. So he actually had two weapons. And interestingly enough, there's another high-profile case that's been going on. Just finished up with closing arguments. You know, Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. There's been all kinds of cute memes and videos and silliness coming out from that trial. You're not going to see that here. It's just not going to be that environment. That Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial was a civil trial, dispute over money. Johnny Depp said, hey, you defame my character, and you defame my character, you owe me 50 million. And she comes back and says, nah, you defame my character, you owe me 100 million. And that's not what we have here. If you walk into a civil courtroom, you'll see, if you walk into a civil courtroom and then you walk into a criminal courtroom, it's like night and day. Because you can walk into a criminal courtroom and the tension, you can cut it with a knife. And really, it's different because we have gang drama. When you have even a criminal case, even if it's just, robbing a liquor store or, a domestic violence, there's, like I said, there's a tension in the courtroom that is palpable, that's tangible. But then when you're talking about the loss of a life, that is ratcheted up, 10, 15 notches, because someone lost their life and you're going to hear the details of it in that trial. That person's never coming back. And it's just, the drama is just different. I remember being in law school and going around to different trials because, I wanted to be a trial lawyer. I wanted to be that lawyer who is presenting in front of a jury, doing a closing argument in front of a jury. And so as a student of the game, because I got to weave some game in there, there might be somebody who ends up watching this video and says, hey, I want to go to law school someday, and is able to see me, able to see somebody who looks just like them, who came from where they came from, who loves what they love, who went through the tragedies and traumas that they went through and can resonate with it. You know what I mean? And so that's why I don't have the suit on. That's another reason I don't have the suit on. Of course, when I go to court, I'm suited up, but this is intentional. I want people to see that you can be from the culture, and if you want to be a lawyer, then you could do that. And if nothing else, because I didn't have this as an example. I didn't have somebody who looked like me and came from where I came from as an example to let me know that this was something that I could do. But like I said, I was going around to different courtrooms and everything and observing trials. And even as a student, as a student of the game, watching, observing, seeing, oh man, I like that. Oh no, I don't like that. I would never say something like that. You pick and choose, you take the good and you reject the bad. But I could feel, you could feel that sense when you're in a criminal courtroom and it's a major crime. There's a lot of hood politics, a lot of drama going on. Both Nipsey and Holder were from the same set. They were from the Rolling 60s in LA. And if you watch this testimony, if you watch this trial, you're going to see, you're going to hear cries. You're going to hear gasps at certain testimony, because they're going to have to say that, there will be testimony. I was standing there when those bullets went into Nipsey and when he fell to the ground, when he breathed his last breath. You're going to hear that. And that's going to be hard for a lot of people to hear, whether we're talking about his family or just the community who loved him in general. That courtroom is going to be packed. They'll probably end up having, a separate courtroom for people to be able to observe. Listen, you coming with the comments. One thing black men can learn from the Nipsey situation: don't join a gang, they don't love you. Well, we can speak on that. We're going to speak on to, there's some testimony that addresses this situation. It's not always black and white. And in fact, most times it's not when people make a decision to join a gang. Can you go to any court and watch trials? For this one, you will be able to. If you wanted to go to LA, you can go and watch that trial. It's open to the public. Trials are open to the public. There will likely be security. A lot of times when you have a murder trial, and if there's gangs involved, there's security going into the courthouse, but then oftentimes there'll be security. There'll be more metal detectors just going into the courtroom. That's how serious it is. And so that brings its own level of tension. You know, normally, obviously, everybody's got to pass through security to get into the building, but you don't usually have another extra layer of security just going into the actual courtroom. But in a case like this, they will. They'll have metal detectors. They'll have security, you know, just making sure that no weapons get brought into the courtroom. And so Nipsey, that beloved figure in LA, you know, I want to talk a little bit about, you know, what goes into the mindset of the lawyers, especially defense attorney, going into a case, going into a case like this, you know, where you're defending somebody facing life in prison. The stakes are just higher. Listen, and any defense attorney who really cares, a true professional, is going to go into it prepared. But when you're defending somebody facing life in prison, you're going in that much more prepared. You have a game plan. You know the evidence like the back of your hand. You've been putting weeks, months, time into your preparation, hours leading up to the trial. And so there's pressure. There's natural pressure. There's a level of nervousness that goes into defending someone in trial. And even more so when you know they're facing life in prison, when it's a murder trial, because you know what's at stake. And actually they say, listen, the moment as a defense attorney, the moment you lose that nervousness, that little bug in your stomach that you get when you go into trial, the moment you lose that, you need to hang it up, because you don't care. It's natural to feel nervousness going into the trial. That's what lets you know you're alive. That's what lets you know you're feeling something. And so this actually happened a while back. So this happened in March 31st, 2019. We're in June. We're going into June of 2022. So, you know, a few years later, about after this incident, we're barely going to trial. And so realistically, when you have major cases, especially homicide trials, you know, it's going to be at least a year, sometimes two, before you get to trial, because there's just so much going into it. You may have, you know, there's just a lot more investigation that needs to go into it on both the prosecution side and the defense side. So as a defense attorney, you're going to have your investigator going out and trying to get surveillance video, trying to go out and shoot video photographs, interviewing witnesses, going to try and collect surveillance video if there's any available. You know, you really have to put together your side as well, because if there's any evidence or any information suggesting that your client didn't do what he or she is alleged to have done, then that can be presented in order to either negotiate a better deal, or in some cases even request that the case be dismissed as against your client. So because the stakes are so high, that's why it can take so long to get to trial in a homicide case. But in this particular case, we had COVID delays. So COVID actually shut down, you know, it shut down courtrooms, full courthouses for months. Whole divisions of prosecutorial agencies were shut down. Labs that are analyzing evidence, those were shut down. You know, availability of jurors. So the jury pool that you end up with, the jury pool that you'll end up seeing on TV, that started with a lot more people that whittled down to the number of juries that you'll see at trial. So they have to pick from a number of people in the community. And so when you have COVID, when you have this major pandemic, that's, you know, social distancing, all this kind of stuff, that affected the ability to proceed to trial any sooner than we're going at this point. But June 2nd is when they're starting. That's when they're starting with jury selection. And so leading up to that, you know, a couple of years ago, so just about a month, just over a month after the incident. So again, this was on March 31st, 2019. They had what's called a grand jury. So grand jury proceedings are not all that common in California. But what it is, a grand jury is when the prosecutor puts evidence in front of a number of citizens, and they have to make a determination as to whether there's probable cause to believe that, number one, a crime has been committed, and number two, the person who's being accused is the person who committed that crime. So it's just probable cause. So it's not, it's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The standard, if you go to trial, is probable cause. It's just to make sure that people are not being held to answer to charges that, there's no evidence whatsoever. They have no business being charged with that particular crime. And so in this situation, the person accused isn't there. They may not even be aware that this grand jury proceeding is going on. And so a lot of times they'll do these when there's a high public interest in the case. So they'll put it in front of a grand jury. There also can be other instances where perhaps the prosecutor feels like the evidence is weak. And so they just kind of want a test run. They'll put it in front of a grand jury and then make a determination, based on the grand jury returning an indictment or not, to then either file charges or not. So if they don't return an indictment, then the case will be closed out, or if they return an indictment, then they can proceed with charges. And so really, there's been criticism over the years in terms of the low standard of probable cause and how prosecutors can pretty much get someone indicted very easily because there are no defense attorneys in the room. It's just the prosecutors. But interestingly enough, the prosecutor has to actually act as the prosecutor, and then they have to act as the defense attorney as well, because they have to put up the what's called exculpatory evidence, or in other words, evidence pointing to the person's innocence or lack of guilt. So they have to put on both sides, and then ultimately the jury makes a determination. The grand jury, they determine whether there will be an indictment on the charges. And so, yeah, even though the standard is really low, again, we're talking about probable cause, grand juries can come back and not indict. In fact, we see this happen a lot with, these officer, shootings where, the case is put in front of a grand jury and they don't return an indictment. Famously, the situation with Deshaun Watson. So NFL quarterback, his case was put in front of a grand jury in Texas on these sexual assault charges. So there were a number of, to answer that question, indictment. What is an indictment? An indictment is when the grand jury finds that there's probable cause to hold a person to answer to charges. That's, they return an indictment. And so, in that situation, he's being accused of a number of sexual assaults. And, it sounds like their defense was basically, hey, something may have happened with these, massage therapists, but anything that happened was consensual. And so the grand jury in that situation had to have believed that because, they didn't come back with an indictment. So that just goes to show that, hey, you can have a case in front of a grand jury and they can find that there is no probable cause, like they did, in that situation with Deshaun Watson. Now, what ultimately happened in those civil cases, that's another story. There's a lower standard, but as it pertains to the criminal case, no indictment. But let's get to what is being alleged in this particular case. And so I'm going to bring up some of these transcripts just to help us go through this, and we'll see what is actually being charged here. So if you look here, so they're saying that they're considering, the grand jury is considering 6 criminal counts. So 1 count of murder. So that was obviously of Nipsey Hussle. Then there's 2 counts of attempted murder. You learn there were 2 other people there who ended up getting shot, unfortunately. Then they have 2 lesser related counts of assault with a firearm. And then there was 1 last count of being a felon in possession of a firearm. So Mr. Holder had already been convicted of a felon of a felony. And so, as you probably know, if you are a convicted felon, then you lose your right to possess firearms. And so if you are caught, if you've already had a felony in your past, then they can charge you with being a felon in possession of a firearm. So it's the information regarding these 6 counts that they'll be putting in front of this grand jury, or that they did put in front of the grand jury, to determine whether crimes were committed and whether this person, Eric Holder, was the person who committed them. And so there's an opening statement. All right. And so when it comes to opening statements, the purpose of the opening statement is for the prosecutor and the defense at trial, but here we're talking about a grand jury. It's for them to basically give information on what happened in the case. All right. So they're not arguing. So you're not supposed to make arguments in an opening statement. It's just to give a roadmap as to what the attorney believes the evidence is going to ultimately show. All right. And so oftentimes, and as will be the case here, you have a lot of testimony. There's a lot of testimony. You have expert witnesses. You have law enforcement officers. You have percipient witnesses. You know, you may have alleged victims involved, and it can be hard. It can be very much challenging when somebody's on the stand for many hours, for many days, and it's very easy to get lost in the sauce in terms of, you know, what's actually going on here. And so an opening statement can make that a little easier for the grand jury in this situation to get an understanding of what is actually being presented. And so just kind of going through the opening statement here. So they're saying, listen, this case involves the death of Nipsey Hussle, and they're giving the background here. So he lived most of his life in South Los Angeles. He became an associate and then a member of a local street gang called the Rolling 60s. He was a fixture in his later teens and then in his early 20s at businesses near the intersection of Slauson and Crenshaw. So we know he had that Marathon store, and then there were other businesses that he had, and these were the businesses where he was providing jobs to people in the community. They say that, you know, his life and his activities started to change when he was, you know, going into his late teen years and 20s. So he was getting away from, you know, the gang activities and moving into music. And so we'll actually see that there was testimony from, you know, what you could call one of his OGs was like, listen, you know, this gang life, and he was an older member of the Rolling 60s. It was like, hey, you got to get out of this. If you want to have, you know, if you want to live a good life, then you need to get out of this. You have opportunities. You're a smart dude. So he started making music, right? And so the ultimate hustler story, you know, hustling music out of the trunk of his car, getting popular in the underground circuit. You know, he started becoming sought after by major labels. He signed a deal, and then, you know, Victory Lap came out, and right out the gate, first major release was nominated for a Grammy. And listen, I had that as my number 2 that year. So for me, I had Daytona. Daytona was my number 1, Pusha T, and then I had Victory Lap as number 2. You know, that's something special to come out of that neighborhood, be a former gang member, and then, you know, your first album out the gate gets nominated for a Grammy. That just goes to show how special he is. And so, like they say, he had fans all over the world. The target, so they don't call a person who is being accused, they're not called the defendant yet, they're called the target. So that was Mr. Holder, who also grew up in LA, South LA, became a member of the Rolling 60s gang, so this Crip gang. So we're going to hear from quite a few people in this, in the grand jury testimony, and then also, you know, at trial, you're going to hear from a number of people who were members of this Rolling 60s gang. And so, interestingly enough, Mr. Holder, and this is something that I'm going to ultimately point out that didn't seem to get as much attention as I think it deserved. But he was also a rapper, so he was an aspiring rapper. He was not nearly. I mean, you can't even say they were in the same stratosphere in terms of the success, but he was an aspiring rapper. And so what they're saying is the case involved the shooting and killing of Nipsey Hussle, and then shooting and injuries to Kerry Lathan and Herman Villanueva on March 31st, 2019. And so, he goes into talking about some of Nipsey's successes on the business side, and how he would, there's testimony that he would go and check in. And interestingly enough, Nipsey did not roll around with security when he was going back to these businesses. So people testified that, hey, Nipsey would just roll up, and he, when he went out on tour, he would have security. But when he was just going to the store to check in on things, he would come out, sign autographs, he would take pictures, he would talk to people. Just a man of the people. And so eventually, on this particular date, Eric Holder showed up. Right. And so it wasn't anything that was planned. He just happened to show up. And he didn't know Nipsey was going to be there. There was nothing to suggest that he was already going to be there. And so he was with someone else that they're calling witness number one. All right. So they don't disclose her name for her protection. Right. So because, what you'll come to find out is Mr. Holder was in witness number one's car. She was the one who had drove him to the location. And then after he's alleged to have shot Nipsey and these other two individuals, he went back to that car and then they took off. And so for her own protection, because again, you can see on Twitter, there was a lot of talk about, the green light on Eric Holder. So if he hadn't been picked up, if he wasn't taken into custody, then he probably could have been killed in the streets. And so naturally, without people not necessarily knowing how this thing went down, people probably would have assumed that witness number one was in on it, and and therefore she might have to go too. So they've done what they can to keep her public or her personal information out of the public eye. But nonetheless, eventually Holder goes and has a conversation with Nipsey. Right. And that conversation, they're saying, is really important because at some point Nipsey mentioned, and there will be there will be testimony. There will be testimony that Nipsey had brought up something to the effect that Holder might have been snitching, which, there will be expert testimony, and there will also be, testimony from some of the witnesses about how serious of an accusation that would end up being. And so the other interesting part is that this conversation, it wasn't intense. There wasn't, there was no animosity between Nipsey and Holder. It never really got heated. It was just kind of a matter of fact conversation. But then eventually he leaves and goes back to the car, and they drive around a little bit, and he starts to eat the food that he went to get before having the conversation with Nipsey, and then basically instructs witness number one, tells her to kind of pull over, and eventually he grabs his gun, he gets out of the car, and witness number one testifies that she heard shots being fired. And then obviously the people that were at the scene heard shots being fired. And eventually Holder runs back to the car, and then they take off. So that's basically, what their opening statement was. And that's essentially what you'll hear is the basic facts of the case. And I think it's just interesting to kind of go through some of the other testimony that you have here, so you can see, what this case is ultimately based on. And so one of the main witnesses, his name is Herman Douglas. And, I just wanted to select out a couple of portions of his testimony because it's helpful to see, what his involvement was and the insight that he had to provide. And so Mr. Douglas, he's from LA, 46 years old, from South LA. They continue to mention South LA. What does he do? So he actually had different jobs within some of Nipsey's businesses. And so in the beginning of his testimony, they're just kind of walking through his relationship. So he says, hey man, like, we were just good friends. It was like almost like a father-son relationship. It was just, we were really good friends. And they had met back in 2003. And so he was working at these stores and just kind of doing odd jobs there. And so they're kind of laying the foundation for the relationship between him and Nipsey. And so here he's talking about how sometimes, when Nipsey would actually show up to the businesses. So there were some months when, it basically at least once a month, he would come through and check up on the businesses. And, he would, like I said, he would meet fans, he would take pictures, again, a man of the people. And again, he emphasizes that when Nipsey would come up, he didn't really have security with him. He didn't have security. And that just kind of goes to show, for him, a lot of times when you see rappers and they go back to where they came from or go to another city, they'll have security with them. I just found it really interesting that Nipsey didn't roll around with security. So anyhow, they start to talk about, March 31st, right? And at a certain point, a dude he knows is Shitty. So Eric Holder, his nickname was Shitty. And so they called him Shitty, cuz. And I just like, I'm sorry, man. You'd have had to give me a different name. I couldn't go by Shitty. But they say at some point, so Shitty rose up, right? And so this Mr. Douglas mentions, hey, he's a former member of Rolling 60s, and he knew Nipsey was a member of Rolling 60s. He knew Eric Holder was a member of Rolling 60s. So this wasn't like a beef between gang rivals or anything like that. All of these guys were from the same hood. And so Nipsey had recognized him. And so they saw him in the car. And so Nipsey says, hey, is that Shitty? When he sees him going by. And we'll come to find out that he hadn't been around for a while, right? And so they see him in the passenger seat of a car, and then he comes up. So at some point he ended up going to the Master Burger. He went to get food, and then he ends up going to this group. So Nipsey's there, Douglas is there, and a couple other people are there. And Nipsey comes up. He didn't have a shirt on, which is interesting as well. Sometimes you see cats just walking around with no shirt. I couldn't do that unless I'm just at the beach, but hey, that's how some folks get down. So, so they have him identified. Do you recognize this person? Okay, that's Shitty. All right. And so they're asking him, all right, well, how long were you there before Holder gets there? So he was there about 30, 40 minutes before Holder rose up. And so that whole time he was never away from Nipsey. So he was there basically the whole time. Right. And so Nipsey or Holder ends up coming up, and they're asking, okay, well, what was Nipsey's demeanor like right before, Holder pulls up? And so he said, well, hey, we were having a good conversation. We're talking about he just did a video a couple days ago. We're talking about his career. He had just been in the studio. So things are up. All right. So they're reminiscing about old times. And he signed a couple autographs, took some pictures. And so, just basically being his normal self. And so then they're asking, all right, well, so did his demeanor change when Holder pulled up? And he says no. Douglas says no. His demeanor didn't change at all. And so, but what came up was this conversation about his paperwork, and so he says Nipsey was looking out for him, basically saying, hey, they got paperwork on you. He said, I haven't read it. So basically, this was something that Nipsey had apparently heard from around the way, that there's word out there that Holder had been snitching. All right. And so again, this wasn't like it wasn't a hostile situation. It's just a conversation. And so Nipsey was basically saying, hey, you need to handle that. All right. So there's these rumors going around. And so then the prosecutor asks, well, what does that mean? What is the significance of someone saying that there's paperwork on you? And so he's saying, well, when you have a case and when you go to jail or when you get out, then a lot of times people will want to see the documents to see whether, you were an informant, were you cooperating, anything like that. Because if you were, then that can be problematic. All right. So here they're saying, hey, if a gang member says to another gang member, you better be careful because, there's some paperwork or saying that you told or you snitched. What they're referring to is police reports or some type of court documents that show that the person was cooperating with the police or maybe told something about gang business or a crime or something like that. Right. And so again, Nipsey was telling Holder, hey, you better address that or take care of that. And so what he's saying is like, you need to go and check whoever is basically spreading these words about you. Right. And so that's definitely something that you would want to address because it's something major in the hood. If people are talking about, okay, well, how you came home early, right? So if you were supposed to do 15 or you're supposed to do 20 years or you're supposed to do a certain amount of time and you end up coming home after a few months or after a couple of years, then people are going to think, man, what did he do? How's he coming home early? So he must have talked, right? And so that's a serious ordeal. And so then they start asking again, boom, why would you need to clear that up? Because, okay, in gang culture, snitching is not a good thing to do. And they ask, okay, well, what are some of the consequences that can flow from somebody who snitches? And Holder was honest. He said it could be anything from getting beat up to getting killed. And so there was no conversation from Nipsey towards Holder in terms of what specifically was snitched about. They didn't mention any names. They didn't mention any particular cases. There was, there really wasn't any particular context. All right. And so the interesting thing, again, there being no disrespect in this conversation. It just really seemed very matter of fact and to the point. It wasn't anything, that alarming. But here's so, after Nipsey brings that up, after Nipsey's like, hey, I've heard, you, and this is something that you need to go out and address, but they're saying that you might've been snitching. And so Shitty responds like, nah, they're just hating on me. I mean, I didn't snitch on nobody. They're just hating on me. And so Nip says, so just so you know what I'm talking about. And again, Holder's like, nah, they're just hating on me. But the interesting thing is he looked. So Douglas is testifying. He's like, hey, have you heard my rap? Basically, have you heard my new song? He was like, yeah, I've been in the studio. This is Holder talking. He's like, I've been in the studio. I did my new song. Have you heard it? And they were like, nah, we haven't heard it. So, and so then after that, he says, all right, well, then we shook hands and then, he might've took off right after that. And so I was just kind of thinking about this because it seemed like, and I don't think that they mentioned this in the closing argument, But when we're looking at this situation of Nipsey bringing up, have you been snitching, or word on the street is that you've been snitching. Okay, so he's, again, it from the witness testimony, it didn't appear that he was that he was being antagonistic about, about this warning. It was more, him being cool about it. But the interesting thing is when you think about haters, right? When you think about jealousy, Nipsey Hussle at this point is known all over the world, right? So he's reached legendary status at this point. But him and Holder, they're from the same hood. They're from the same set. And somehow Nipsey, again, is famous. He's got, this strip mall. He's got his own businesses. He's got people lining up to sign autographs, to take pictures with them, to have a word with him, because he's this beloved figure in the community. And Shitty comes up and is like, yo, have you heard my music? And they're like, nah, we haven't heard it. So when we're trying to figure out motive, like why did this happen? That's an interesting thing. Was that possibly something that set him over the edge, where somebody just cannot stand to see another brother successful and decide to take his life? It's just something interesting to think about and keep in the back of our minds. And realistically, we may not get the answer to that. Some folks may know, but we may not necessarily get the answer from that, because Holder may or may not take the stand. I don't think there's been any indication as to whether he's going to take the stand, and he doesn't have to make that decision. Really, he doesn't have to make that decision until it's the defense attorneys, or it's the defense's opportunity to present their evidence. And then at that point, they will have to decide whether Holder ends up taking the stand or not. But I think that's a big point that ultimately we have to look at, because as we sit here and try and put the pieces together regarding this senseless tragedy, and we're looking at a conversation that between everybody who was standing there basically said it wasn't anything crazy. It didn't, people weren't yelling, people weren't, just, getting crazy. It was just a matter of fact conversation, but then that leads to this. So again, and the interesting thing is, what Douglas testifies to is he says, listen, when he started mentioning the songs that he was recording, he says, I looked at him and he just looked kind of weird. He's like, I didn't know, maybe he was high, he might've been high or whatever it may be. And so then that ends up becoming another factor, another layer to this. So was he, being high, maybe he misinterpreted this situation. Maybe he went a little further than obviously, in terms of deciding to shoot somebody, but just in his mind, the conversation that Nipsey was having with him in terms of this allegation or this accusation or these rumors going around about him snitching. And then on top of that, being slighted, right? Being slighted, he's standing here and seeing everything that's surrounding Nipsey. And then, kind of asking, yo, you hear my music? And they're like, nah, we didn't hear it. That just might have been enough to set him over the top while being high and being like, okay, well, interpreting that as disrespect. And we all know what can happen when people feel disrespected. When people feel disrespected, they can start fights. They can, pull out a knife, pull out a gun. And apparently that's what ultimately led to this. So again, we have this testimony here, and just kind of moving right along here. I'm gonna skip down because there's a lot of information that is important that ultimately will be important. But in terms of going through this, because we could spend multiple hours going through this, but I want to get you the just the most relevant testimony. But when we get here, so this gentleman, he ends up actually going into the break room, because again, remember, he works at these shops. And so, after they have their conversation, so, Holder ends up leaving, he ends up going in. So he says, I walked into the marathon store, I walked around the counter, and then when I got to the break room, I sat down with my salad and I heard the gunshots. I heard maybe a few gunshots. He ran out. So he didn't actually see the shooting take place because he had already walked back inside. But then when he walks out, when he comes out, then that's when he sees Nipsey on the ground and he sees Holder running. And he sees him run, and there's the white car, and that's the car that Holder ultimately takes off in. And so I thought it was something really interesting to look at when we hear this part of his testimony. He gets later into his testimony when we talk about just the culture. When we talk about the culture, because look here, the prosecutor's asking him, hey, listen, I asked you earlier if you were a Rolling 60s gang member, right? And he's like, yeah, you asked me that. And he said, well, how did you answer the question? And he said, listen, I was raised in the neighborhood. So he was raised in that neighborhood. And so now I try to stop people from becoming gangbangers. So listen, like he came up, he was in the Rolling 60s, and he admits that he's still around the way. He's still there. He's still in the same neighborhood, but he's now trying to stop people from being gangbangers. And he said, hey, listen, this is what I was basically trying to do with Nipsey. So Nipsey was one of the people that he was trying to teach to not do gangbanging. Do other options, music, basketball, football, something else. And this is also, as a person who then ends up representing people who unfortunately make bad decisions, take actions. This is why I give so much props and respect to, I've got a lot of friends who have coached football, who have taught music. I used to teach music. I taught music at a middle school. I lost the word, at a middle school. And I've got friends who coach, basketball, football, coach sports. These things, these activities that basically occupy kids' time so they don't have time to fall into doing stupid stuff. That's why I give so much props to those folks who give who just give their time and invest in the youth in order to be that uncle figure, to be that father figure, to be that guidance. So listen, like you don't have to do this here. There's other ways to navigate this life. And so that's what he was basically trying to do. And so they're asking him about this culture because, the prosecutor in front of the grand jury is trying to make sense of how these guys who are no longer, 16, 17, 18, 19, how are we still talking about this when these folks are in their late 20s, early 30s and the like? And so the prosecutor's asking, well, when it comes to, getting out of a gang, sometimes they've heard that you're in a neighborhood, you don't just get out, you kind of redirect your energy. You stop engaging in certain criminal activities, but you're still loyal to the neighborhood. And so Douglas comes back and says, hey, listen, you don't have to be loyal. You're always going to be affiliated. Right. And what he says, that's interesting. He says, listen, if your mom grew up in Inglewood, then likely you're going to be affiliated with Inglewood, even if you don't bang. Whether you bang or not, you're going to be affiliated just because where you grew up in. He says it depends on where your mama grew up at. And so I just kind of found that interesting because it took me back to, there was a time when I was in a training put on by a gang psychologist, and we hear a lot of times about whether people are, products of their environment or whether, so it's that balance between being a product of your environment or personal responsibility, that argument you get. And interestingly enough, in this seminar, so this psychologist who pretty much exclusively deals with issues regarding gangs was teaching us as defense attorneys just certain things to look out for and things that can be useful when we're representing people who are alleged to be gang members or were ex-gang members or the like when that issue comes up. And he posted this table. It was like a chart. And the more boxes you checked off as you went down, there was, just this high percentage. So there was this huge high percentage that you would end up becoming a gang member yourself. And so the boxes were like, whether you're a boy versus girl, because there's just a lot more male gang members than there are females. Do you have one parent in the household? Do you have two parents in the household? Or do you have no parents in the household? So like, are you being raised by a grandmother or a grandfather? Because, let's just be honest. If you're a little kid running around, getting into trouble, when grandma is 60, 70 years old and just doesn't have the energy, is just so disconnected to be able to be on top of properly disciplining. And I'm not saying that that's not all across the board, but, it's just different. So do you have parents in the household or not? What is the household income, right? Because a lot of times what the household income is going to dictate where the person ends up living. Is the kid participating in any extracurricular activities? Again, if you have football practice every afternoon, or if you have band practice every afternoon, or you got to practice your instrument, or you're running drills, or you're out shooting basketballs, every afternoon or what have you, the more you're occupied with those type of things, the more you're distracted from what's going on in your hood. And so that's where these extracurricular activities become important. And so if there are no extracurricular activities, is there a YMCA there? Is there a Boys and Girls Club there? And shout out to the Oceanside Boys and Girls Club. That's where I came up at. That kept me off the streets where I was coming up at. That kept me safe and away from the gang activity that was going on where I was growing up. And so again, as we went down this table, the more boxes you ended up having to check off, I don't remember what the figure was, but it was a very high likelihood that you would end up becoming a gang member. So then we end up touching on the issue and the question of, is it really an issue of personal responsibility, or is it the product of the environment? And yes, we all have our own, we have our own will, we have our own volition. But the interesting thing is, listen, you don't know what you don't know. So you only know what's going on around you unless somebody puts you up on game, unless somebody teaches you something different. And so this is why, listen, and a lot of times it's interesting, when we look at other areas, more affluent areas, and say, okay, well, why don't we have all this violence and gang activity and drugs and all this kind of stuff? Well, they're insulated from it. Wherever you have poverty and lack of resources, lack of job opportunities, lack of, just basic needs, then you're going to have these type of environments. And so, listen, and that would oftentimes get it frustrating when I would interact with prosecutors who are just so far removed from the way just common people live, especially on the issue of, gang affiliations. They say, well, he's affiliated with the known Crip, or he's affiliated with known Bloods, or what have you. And it's like, no, that's just his cousin. that's just his brother, or that's his sister. If you're from Torrey Pines and your dad's a doctor, your mom's an engineer, how would you know? What do you know about this? But yet you are making decisions just, with the stroke of a pen, you checking off a box that can have a lifelong implication as against this person, not understanding anything about the culture and how somebody could be affiliated with being a gang member, right? And so as we move on, we end up with the testimony of Kerry Lathan. So he's another key witness. And Mr. Lathan, man, this is just such a tragedy what ended up happening with Mr. Lathan. because he had only been home for just a number of months, might have been around 7 months or so when this actually happened. So Kerry went to prison in like 94 for murder, right? So he went to prison for murder. He got out in 2018. So he got out in 2018, just months before this happened. So again, this incident took place March 31st, 2019, and he got out in 2018. And so he ends up getting out, and he had said, because he ends up getting arrested, right? And so he's in custody, can't get out of custody, and there's a Vlad TV interview. And I'm gonna leave that aside, but DJ Vlad was a real one for posting this video so that more people could understand and know about what ended up happening with this situation. So he ended up in custody basically because they alleged that it was a parole violation for him being around a known gang member. So him even just having contact with Nipsey and whoever else was around there, so Holder was there, whatever, they were able to say, okay, well, we're going to take you into custody on this parole violation. And so again, in this conversation, because the video, if you watch it, it's actually a jail call. So he's calling from jail, and I think Big U had ended up setting up the call. So Big U set up the call. So Kerry is having this conversation with DJ Vlad, and he's telling him what happened. And he says, hey, listen, I just come home. I don't have a job. I don't really have a whole lot going on, but what ended up happening, and this is part of this is where you hear one of the parts where Nipsey was just a real one. So he didn't really know Nipsey like that, right? They're from the same hood. He was rolling 60s, but he's older. So he was older than Nipsey, but Nipsey had a care package. Nipsey had a care package delivered to him once he got out. So he got him some clothes, so, some shirts and everything. So he did have some clothes when he got out of custody. Because again, he went in 94, got out in 2018. And it's kind of funny because he was like, yo, the world is completely different. So he had kids, and then he had grandkids. So he was talking about just using a cell phone and how how his 9-year-old granddaughter knew how to use a phone more than him. And you think about it, man, if you went in 94, 96, something like that, late 90s, he goes in, how much technology, just how the whole world has evolved since you've been in. And so he gets out, and again, Nipsey shows him love, gets him clothes and everything. And so he was going to go to basically to console someone he knew from around the way whose dad had just died. So he was riding around with his nephew, and they were just going to go, like I said, to go to this person's house to just kind of, console them. Because again, their dad had just died. And so his nephew was making fun of him, like, listen, man, you've been wearing like the same clothes every day. We got to get you some new clothes. Let's, let's roll and get you a shirt. And so he was talking about this shirt that he wanted. It's just like a white shirt. And they had gone to the Marathon store, and he was like, yo, like, Nipsey's there. Let's go pull up. So he's just going to get a shirt. He's just going to get a shirt. And less than 3 minutes after him and his nephew pull up, that's when the shots are fired. So just a chance encounter. He had nothing to do with whatever conversation was going on, whatever, drama might have been going on between Nipsey and Holder. And again, it didn't necessarily appear that there was any drama between them, but he had nothing to do with it. Just happened to pull up on the scene, was going to get a new shirt. So he wasn't looking bummy when he pulled up to this family's house. And that's when he got shot. And he recalls he got shot. He got hit in the pelvis, and basically his legs gave out. He fell to the ground, and he said, like, he lost some of the feeling in his legs in that moment, and that's why he couldn't get up. But he saw that, he didn't see who it was. He just saw a gun and he saw a flash from the muzzle, and that's when, obviously the shots rang out. And his nephew was actually shot as well, but the bullet hit his belt buckle. Talk about divine intervention. The bullet hit his belt buckle, and that's, how he survived. And so he got shot, and unfortunately, he's now in a wheelchair, so he can't walk around. He, at the time, and I don't know what his state is now, but basically, I think during the time of that interview, or sometime thereafter, they were telling him he was going to have to learn how to walk again. So he was put in a wheelchair, and then, adding insult to injury, he ended up getting arrested on a parole violation when he didn't have anything to do with it. And so the interesting thing is, like, they were trying to say, hey, Nipsey is a gang member, and so you are prohibited from associating with known gang members. And he's like, no, Nipsey's a community activist. He's not an active gang member. Nipsey's about to meet with the chief of police to address gang violence and gun violence. So this was such an act of adding insult to injury in this situation. And so this was just another portion of, the testimony that shows the aftermath of this shooting. And so that's where the attempted murder comes from. So on Lathan and on Sherman Villanueva, so his nephew, so that's where the second, or the 1 and 2 assault with firearm charges, and then the attempted murder charges come from. So the other major witness is witness number 1. So again, as I mentioned earlier, there's no mention of her actual name for her protection, because she's not gang affiliated at all. She didn't know Nipsey. She really didn't even know Holder very well. Interestingly enough, she had only met Holder about a month or so before this incident took place. So talk about just quite a few people in this situation being at the wrong place at the wrong time. So she had one day job, and then she would do, it sounded like she drove for like Uber or Lyft. So she was doing ride shares, and that's how she ended up meeting Holder. I think he was a passenger. And so they end up connecting and then start hanging out. So they're doing their thing. It's not, they're not a boyfriend girlfriend relationship, but they had a situation, right? So she says they had been involved, and so on the day of the incident, she had gone to work, and then after that they connected, and they were just kind of rolling around. They were rolling around, and at some point they were going to go get something to eat. And they're kind of rolling around. They get to this strip mall. They're around there where Nipsey is, and that's when she noticed Nipsey. So she's like, "Oh, he's fine. I want to go take a picture." Which probably would have been, interesting too. So as we put these pieces together, again, we have Holder and we have Nipsey, both from the same hood, both rolling 60s, both Crips, both rappers. But Holder, his career isn't really popping like that. And I don't know. I've never heard his music. He could be dope, or he, that's done now, but he might have been nice with it. But he hadn't broke. Nipsey is a star. Nipsey is a celebrity, right? So there might have been just a little, even more salt on the wound here in terms of his jealousy towards Nipsey. And I don't know, because I haven't spoken to him. Nobody, he hasn't come out and made a statement for why he's done what he's done. But, we have to sit up and take these pieces and put together and think, like, what would have driven him to do this? And so, yeah, I mean, this chick you've been involved with or what have you, you're rolling around, and at some point she sees the same dude from your hood that you came up with. It's like, ooh, he's fine. I want to take a picture with him. So, they end up pulling over. right? So they pull over and he's actually going out to get food. So he ends up going to the Master Burger. But interestingly enough, he did not give her any indication that he knew Nipsey. So she says, again, she calls out, "Ooh, that's Nipsey. He's fine." But he just, like, he was silent. He didn't really say anything. So it wasn't like he was like, "Oh man, F him," or, anything. Like, there was no reaction. But they end up pulling over. He goes to get the food. So he goes to place his order and then comes back. And that's when he goes to talk to Nipsey, right? And has that conversation. And so as he's having the conversation with the group, she sees the opportunity. "Ooh, I'm going to get out. I'm going to get out and take a picture." So she gets out of the car and basically approaches the group. And she was like, "Oh, I want to take a picture." And they're telling her like, "Yo, wait, we're having a conversation." Because again, at this point, that's when, Nipsey's telling Holder, "Hey, listen, I heard something about, there being paperwork and, something about you snitching. So you need to address that." So what she overhears coming up, what she hears, because again, this conversation is already going. And when she's coming up, she heard something to the effect of Holder saying, "Oh, so you never snitched before?" And Nipsey's like, "Nah, nah," and so that's all she really heard in terms of that topic. So she basically walked in on Holder asking Nipsey if he had ever snitched, and Nipsey basically like, "Nah," just kind of brushing that off. So eventually she ends up taking the picture, right? So she gets her selfie. She takes a selfie with Nipsey, and she testified she was happy about it. Obviously, she was happy. She got a chance to take a selfie with a celebrity. She ends up going back to her car and she posted the selfie to Facebook, right? So she posted a selfie, and Eric stayed there. So Eric Holder's still there talking to them, and then he went back to the Master Burger and then came back to the car and he was asking for money. All right, so he asked her for like $2. She gave him a $5, and then he goes back. So. And probably I'd have these details down a little more if I spent more time with the transcript, but I just didn't have the time. But the sequence of events, at some point he grabs the food and they pull off and he takes a gun out and starts loading it. Right. And so this was the first time, at least in terms of that encounter between witness number one and Holder, that she saw a gun. So and so she had said, like, I mean, she's naturally tripping about it because she sees the gun and is like, "Yo, you're not about to do a drive-by in my car," right? Because again, she's not a gangster, she's not affiliated, she didn't have nothing to do with that life. And so at some point he has her pull over so he can eat. He has these chili cheese fries that he's eating, and then he's eating some and then basically tells her to wait. And so again, initially he was shirtless. He didn't have a shirt on, but then he ends up putting his shirt on. It's a red shirt he puts on. He gets out of the car. And just moments later, witness number one hears gunshots. And so she's naturally freaking out. There's gunshots. She doesn't know what happened. She doesn't necessarily know what was it. Was it Mr. Holder that shot? Was it somebody shooting at him? Was he even involved in that? She just heard the shots, but she didn't take off. She waited. And so then eventually he comes up and he tells her, "Hey, drive, or I'll slap you." And she had said that this was kind of the first time that he had gotten aggressive with her, right? But he basically tells her, "Take off or I'll slap you." So they end up taking off. And eventually he asks her, "Hey, can I stay at your place?" And the excuse that he gave her was that, "Hey, my place is dirty. Can I stay at your place?" And she's like, "Nah, you can't stay at my place." And interestingly enough, she doesn't even necessarily put two and two together in terms of Holder being the shooter in that moment. She finds out later. I think she said that on the news. The news came out that Nipsey had been shot. And then that's when she kind of understood. And so Holder was asking, could he stay at her place? And again, he gave the excuse, "Oh, my place is dirty. Can I stay at your place?" And she was like, "Nah, you can't stay at my place." And he was like, "All right, well, can you get me a motel? Rent me a room at a Motel 6." And then his reason for that was his ID was expired. So, hey, rent me a room. And she was like, I think she said she couldn't do that either. And so at some point she ended up going to the police station to basically tell her side of the story or tell what she knew. And apparently she had been rejected initially, which just threw me off completely. I wanted to look into that a little more, but I didn't have the time. But so she was initially rejected, and then she came in and then, gave about a 5-hour statement. So during the grand jury proceedings, they ended up playing, I want to say, around an hour worth of surveillance video from different angles and just videos that they ended up having an analysis to show that Holder was the one who ended up firing these shots. And so in this situation, I mean, there's the testimony, and during this grand jury proceeding, there would have been probably a gang detective who would have been able to give testimony and give a little more insight in terms of gang life and how things work and everything. Appletree, this question, what if he didn't know he was near a gang member? So in his mind, if we're talking about Kerry Lathan, he in his mind, I mean, he was saying he didn't even see Nipsey as a gang member. At this point, he saw Nipsey as a celebrity because he had met him either once or twice before this incident, and they were brief situations. So he had gone in and talked to his parole officer about the situation, and he was like, "Listen, I know Nipsey like I know you. I've come in, we've talked a couple times, but like I don't know him like that. And as far as I know, he's a celebrity. He's a rapper. I'm not really looking at him like a gang member like that." So it just was really, just adding insult to injury that he not only would get shot, basically trying to get some clothes to be able to console somebody else whose dad had died, but within just less than 3 minutes of arriving at this situation, to end up getting shot, and then to end up in a wheelchair, and then to end up in custody on a parole violation was just the worst luck ever. So that's basically what the testimony is. I mean, there's a lot more. Like I said, this grand jury transcript was around 500 pages. So we picked out the main information from here. So then the question is like, all right, well, why is this going to trial then, right? So if there's all this evidence against him, why is he going to trial? There's video of him, walking up. There's video of him firing these weapons. There's, witness number one, Lathan, Douglas, they all put him at the scene. So interestingly enough, there was talks, and I haven't, looked into these alternate theories, but there was talks that he was supposed to be paid like $75,000 to kill Nipsey. And I don't know how much credibility can be lent to that. That obviously would be a tragedy if this was a contract killing, but I've heard something to that effect. If that is the case, then obviously that's not a defense. I mean, murder for hire is a that's a crime. And if he were going to, let's just say if he were paid to do this and then carried it out, if he was going to raise that as an issue, that probably would have come out by now, perhaps, but maybe not. There hasn't been a whole lot of information that's been coming out about this case. But so one of the other interesting things is Holder was originally represented by Christopher Darden, and so we know Christopher Darden from the prosecution team in the OJ Simpson trial. All right, so he ended up crossing over to the other side, and now he's a defense attorney, and Holder apparently had retained him, but Christopher Darden ended up getting death threats, and ended up getting off the case. So he subbed out. And that's crazy. There is no case. There's no case. There's no job. There's no amount of money that's worth, receiving death threats over. And really, for me, it's just not a case that I would take on. Interesting enough, in my capacity as an appointed attorney, so I'm a private defense attorney. I have my own law practice, but I also have served as a public defender, kind of as in the office of assigned counsel. So you have the public defender, which is the primary public defender, and then you have the alternate public defender if there's a conflict, and then if there's a third level of conflict, then you have a panel of private attorneys who basically serve as public defenders. And so I was appointed a case to represent a white supremacist. And it was funny. I want to say, because this was years ago, I think he either had a swastika on his forehead or might have had like white power on his forehead or, on his arm. It was prominent. And so, I get assigned the case. I go and, I get into the jail, into the little holding cell to meet with him. And it was like this little thing where we didn't have to say it. It was obvious what he had going on. I'm obviously what I look like. No, like, man, I'm not tripping. Like if you think you are in some or any way supreme or superior to me, then that's your business, not mine. But listen, I'm just here to do my job. Let's do this. I'm gonna get you the best possible result regardless. And so it was interesting. We had a cool little thing while I was representing him. But I say that to say I've been in situations where I represented somebody who, it may not necessarily be something that you would think makes sense. But in this case, if Holder contacted me, I wouldn't represent him. Nope. No, I'm good. I'll leave that to the next person. And not even necessarily with the because of the death threats thing. I mean, that'd be sufficient in and of itself. I'm not trying to have my life in danger, my family, people close to me in danger for somebody I'm representing. But just, I'm not, I'm definitely not representing somebody who killed Nipsey Hussle. So yeah, so Darden's off the case, and so Holder's being represented by the public defender. And the public defender, the guy representing him, issued a statement, and he was talking about the date of the incident. So talking about March 31st, 2019. And he says, hey, well, he was under a lot of emotional duress that day. He was very close to his mother, who had recently passed away just a few months before. He's also had a substantial mental health history predating all of this, and he was getting treatment, and his medication dosage was high. So I don't know that any of that rises to the level of a defense or even really a justification. And that's me on the defense side of things. Listen, sometimes you just don't have a defense. Sometimes a person just did what they're alleged to have done, and there's not really much there. But what you could say, right? What you could say is that, he's just a victim of his environment, right? But in terms of a legal defense that he would have available to him, I'm just not seeing it. Right. So to the extent the defense attorney is trying to say that he may not have necessarily been in a good mind state, the counter to that is, well, he was, he had enough lucidity or enough presence of mind to engage in a discussion with Nipsey about, whether there's, paperwork on him or whether he was snitching, then ask Nipsey if he was snitching, then talk about the music that he was recording, asking if they heard it, right? Had gone to order food, then went to have this conversation with them, went to get money from witness number one, went back to pay for the food, came back, went to go eat it, went back to the car, loaded a gun, went back to the scene, shot Nipsey, shot Lathan, shot Villanueva, right? And then he kicked Nipsey. He kicked Nipsey after. So it's and then not only that, he went back to the car and tells witness number one, "Hey, go drive, or I'll slap you." So it's just too many things that he's doing in that moment to really call into question his state of mind. And reasonable minds could disagree, and eventually we'll see what the defense position is. But I mean, it's hard to see what any defense is really going to be. But interesting, the other part of this is that, listen, when the prosecutor, so it is the people of the state of California who are prosecuting Eric Holder. And in this country, you have a right. You have a right to defend yourself. Hey, Miss Clark, how you doing? That's a fellow defense attorney in the chat here. Fellow defense and criminal defense and immigration attorney. What's up? Yeah, she agrees. Not too much here to get him out of this one. That's another defense attorney chiming in. But he has a right to trial. All right. So one of those constitutional rights, is a right to a trial in front of a jury. Right. And so there are instances where you say, or where you have this conversation with your client, and thanks for pulling up, Dennis. That's another that's my fellow USD law graduate. So what's up, man? Good seeing you. When you have a trial situation, or when you have a case and you're facing charges, you have the right to say, hey, if you want to charge me with this, prove it. Because it will not be Holder's burden of proving that he's innocent. It's not Holder's burden of proving that he didn't do it. It's the prosecution's burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed the crime that he's being charged with. And it looks like he's going to be able to do that. Or excuse me, it looks like they're going to be able to do that. But he can have them do that. Listen, I had a case a few years ago that I've mentioned, where my client was charged with 50 some odd burglaries. Right. And so he had already had 2 strikes. And so at this point, my sister's in the chat. What's up, Yolanda? I love you. What's up? So he had, he was facing he was facing hundreds of years in prison based on the situation, based on the number of burglaries that he was facing, and burglary charges, and his criminal history, and the strikes and the calculations. Like, it starts to look like a word problem, like a math problem when you have folks who have a significant criminal history. And so he was facing so many years in prison that he was like, let's just go to trial. Let's just go. And so we sat through like a month of trial, burglary after burglary after burglary after burglary, and there really wasn't much of a defense. But that was his right. And so we put it on for him. And so, yeah, in this situation, Holder, when you have the negotiations, because once a person is charged, and I know this case started by way of a grand jury versus the traditional arraignment where you enter your not guilty plea, and then you have a readiness conference, a status conference, to determine whether it's going to go to a preliminary hearing. See, you've probably heard of a preliminary hearing, a probable cause hearing. Well, the grand jury proceeding is what replaced that, right? To have the prosecution demonstrate that there's probable cause that a crime's been committed, and that the person being accused is the person who committed those offenses. And so at some point there will have been discussions between the defense and the prosecution. So the prosecution turns over all the evidence that they have, right? So they would have turned over all these witness statements, all these surveillance videos, all these photographs, all this evidence for the defense attorney to review, and then review with his client. And then in the meantime, ideally, the defense attorney is have an investigation conducted. So his investigation team is looking into any witnesses that they can have interviewed, shoot video, take photographs and everything. And then also researching any legal issues. Are there any legal issues that you can use in order to put your client in a better position. But at some point, there will be a discussion between the prosecution and the DA in terms of whether this case can settle. And normally in just your run-of-the-mill cases, pretty much anything short of murder and other serious type cases, the DA will give an offer, right? So if you're being charged with, a felony assault and felony, felony assault and a number of other charges as misdemeanors, then they might offer, depending on the situation, they might offer the misdemeanor assault. They'll offer you something short of, of what you would face if you were to go to trial, right? So not to get too far left field, but if they make you an offer, they're going to offer you something less than you would face if you went to trial. But in these type of cases, the DA may not even make an offer. The DA will have the defense make an offer. And you got to come with something that's going to be, a defense offer for them to take it seriously, especially, I don't know what his criminal history was, but, basically for him to make an offer, it at least, because he's around 30, early 30s. So he probably would have had to make an offer of 30, 35 years. So that, or maybe even 40. Such that when he would get out, he would be like 72 or something like that. Anything short of that, So when you have that situation, it's hard to get somebody to sign a change of plea form for 40 years. So in that situation, it's like, all right, well, we might as well just go to trial. What's up, Shawty? You asking me? It's Mr. Kersey, not Mr. Jersey, but that's all good. But can I do a breakdown of R. Kelly's case? I'll probably get to that. I know that, he's got some motions. I actually downloaded some of the motions for a new trial. I don't know if they've heard that yet, but Robert Kelly is in some trouble. Even if, let's just say he were to, beat this case, there's another state case. So he's got other cases. So, it's hard to see Mr. Kelly ever seeing the light of day again outside of custody. But yeah, we'll probably get to that. But yeah, so when they're having these discussions, they're probably, cases go to trial because the defense and the prosecution couldn't come to an agreement. All right. And so, this is just a tragedy. Shadi, it's all good. We all make mistakes. It's a tragic story, but this is how it's going to ultimately play out. Again, jury selection starts on June 2nd, and that'll generally take a number of days. It could be days, it could be, the whole week, because they end up having to find, weed out people who cannot be fair and impartial, and ultimately find a jury who can be fair and impartial, who can listen to the evidence and ultimately make a decision, regarding guilty, not guilty, based on law and fact, not bringing in, outside emotions and prejudices, such that the prosecution and Mr. Holder, such that they couldn't get a fair trial. So we're going to get into it. And so that's coming up. And yeah, so if it's June 2nd that they start picking the jury, then we'll probably get testimony the week after that. And so definitely we'll be staying tuned. Again, it's just a tragic story. And again, I go back to that song, Kendrick Lamar bringing up the culture, and how so much stuff just so much stuff is done for the culture, and so much stuff is excused and tolerated for the culture. And we've got issues that we've got to address. That becomes a whole nother topic of conversation. But yeah, those peremptory strikes. Yeah, when you're picking a jury, you get more peremptory challenges. And so what those are is when you have the courtroom is full, it's full of potential jurors, because now you're trying to get down to 12, and maybe, probably in a case like this, they probably have like four alternates, just in case somebody gets sick, or, God forbid somebody dies, or is just not available, then they can have those alternate jurors. And so you get, so each side gets what are called peremptory challenges, where they can, for whatever reason, as long as it's not based on like race or religion, where you can exclude a potential juror. A lot of times the defense is excluding jurors that they think are going to be, harmful to their case, and the prosecution is doing so as well. And so, so there are people who end up getting, kicked off the jury, or kicked off the jury for cause, meaning that, just legally they cannot be a part of the jury, because it would be, they just cannot be fair and impartial. And then you have peremptory challenges. So, let's just say in there's a drunk driving charge, right? So a person's being charged with driving under the influence of alcohol, and you have a mother whose son was, killed by somebody who was driving under the influence of alcohol. And she's like, listen, I cannot be fair and impartial in this case. Once I hear testimony that, such and such had alcohol in his system and then got behind the wheel, like I will just see red. I'll think about my son. So there's no way I could be fair and impartial in this case. So then that person would be kicked for cause. So that wouldn't be something where you have to use one of your peremptory challenges. It would be something where, both sides basically agree, hey, she cannot possibly be fair and impartial, so we'll have her removed for cause. But then you have each side, prosecution and defense, has those peremptory challenges where they can say, I don't really care for this person. I don't want them on my jury, and you can have them excluded. But I think that's about it. We're getting to the end. I've been going for quite a while now, about an hour and a half. Wanted to catch you guys up, let you know what is going on or what is to come in this trial. Again, rest in peace to Nipsey Hussle, and thoughts and prayers to his friends, his family, his loved ones, all of his supporters. And I think we're going to go ahead and close this one out. I'll be going live in the near future, talking more about this case, breaking down some of the analysis. So I definitely want to thank each and every one of you for rocking with me. Thank you. My sister is very much a pleasant surprise to have my sister in the chat. Apple Tree wants to say nice beard. Thank you. Appreciate that. But yeah, I definitely appreciate the support. I started doing this, started the channel in order to just provide access to information. A lot of people, don't know an attorney, don't have an attorney in their life, and let alone somebody who they have access to, somebody who's just more accessible, and be able to break down these things for you. And then on top of that, these are things that people are just interested in. People want to know more about these situations. And so, yeah, breaking this stuff down. And so I'll have more useful and interesting and entertaining content coming soon. So if you haven't already, hop on to Facebook, hop on to YouTube and subscribe to the channel. Like this video when it drops, and turn on the notifications so you'll always be notified when I drop a new video. And so we're going to close this thing out. All right. Thanks so much for supporting. I appreciate it. God bless. Enjoy the rest of your day. Peace.